Hello everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to discover what happens when Anna's first ordinary preschool day suddenly turns into an urgent clinic visit, and a mysterious cleared hospital bill makes Miss Diep and James wonder who is secretly paying for this little girl's breath. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The morning started gently enough. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, striping the floor. The apartment smelled like instant coffee and toast, because that was all the budget allowed this week. On the wall, pencil lines marked how much the girls had grown. Nye's line climbing steadily. Anna's inching up like she was still catching up from the months she missed inside the womb. "Mom, my sock is inside out again," Anna complained, hopping on one foot. "That's because you pulled it off with your teeth yesterday," New said, tying her own laces. "Gravity remembers." Miss Diep bent over with a small groan and fixed the sock herself. Her lower back pulsed in protest. Some mornings she felt every year of her life, and a few she hadn't lived yet. "You're not 20 anymore," her body whispered. "Who has time to be 20? Her life replied. "Are you sure you're okay?" James asked quietly from the kitchen doorway, watching her straighten slowly. "I'm fine," she said, which meant, "My back hurts, my head is buzzing, but we don't have time for that right now." He didn't argue, but he did pull out the chair for her. "Breakfast," he said. "Doctor's orders, and by doctor, I mean me." "Fake doctor," Nye muttered. "Real pancake maker." Anna climbed into her seat and swung her legs, already humming the hand-washing song from school. "Sunflower class," she sang. "Wash, wash, wash, don't touch your face or you bring home every germ in the city," James finished. He meant it as a joke, but the word germ still made something tighten in Miss Diep's chest. "Scared again?" he asked softly, catching the flicker in her eyes. "Always," she admitted, spreading jam on toast that wasn't quite bread and wasn't quite cake. "It's autumn. People cough. People forget to cover their mouths. Her lungs are stronger now," he reminded her. "Dr. Harper said so." "Stronger is not invincible," she said. He didn't argue with that either. By 10 o'clock, the apartment was quiet. Anna was at preschool. Nye was at big kid school. The small rooms, crowded with noise just an hour before, now held only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint echo of a cartoon song. Too quiet. Miss Diep sat at the table, bills spread in front of her like a losing hand of cards. Rent, utilities, a medical invoice from months ago that made her stomach twist. She knew every number by heart. Her phone lay face up beside the papers. Every time it buzzed with a spam message or discount code, her heart jumped, ready for a nurse's voice or a teacher's number. Normal mothers don't sit like this, she thought. Normal mothers do laundry and forget where their phone is. Normal mothers don't listen for ghosts of machines in the silence. The phone rang. Her hand moved before her brain, snatching it up. "Hello? Miss Diep? It's Ms. Carter from the Sunflower Room." The world narrowed to that one voice. "Yes," she said, already on her feet. "Is Anna?" "She's okay," Miss Carter said quickly. "She's with me, but she's coughing more than I like and she looks a little pale. She says her chest feels scratchy." Given her history, I wanted to call you right away. History. A gentle word for nightmares. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Miss Diep said. "You don't have to run." But the line was already dead. She grabbed her bag, her keys, and her fear, all in one motion. The walk to the school had never felt so long. The building came into view, cheerful flowers painted on the walls, a sun on the door. It looked like a place where nothing truly bad could happen. Hospitals had looked safe from the outside, too. Inside the sunflower room, the air smelled like crayons and sanitizer. Children's laughter floated from the far corner, but Miss Diep didn't hear it clearly. All her attention snapped to the little form on the beanbag under the window. Anna's curls stuck damply to her forehead. Her cheeks were too pink. Every few seconds, a dry, tearing cough shook her small chest. "There's my girl," Miss Diep said, kneeling so fast her knees would complain about it later. Anna smiled, weak but real. "Mom," she said, voice rough. "Miss Carter said I'm a sick sunflower." "She's a very honest teacher," James said behind her. Miss Diep turned in surprise. "You're here?" "I was 10 minutes away," he said simply. "School called both numbers. I told them the truth. You move faster than I do." He crouched on the other side of the beanbag, his brow furrowing as a cough stole Anna's breath for a second longer than comfort allowed. "Her oxygen is fine," Miss Carter said, holding up a small fingertip monitor. 98. No fever yet, but with her lungs, and the way she says it hurts when she breathes in. She met Miss Diep's eyes. "I think she needs her pediatrician, or at least urgent care." The word urgent dropped them all into another time. For a moment, Miss Diep saw not the bright classroom, but white halls, rushing shoes, a nurse saying, "Mom, you need to step back." She reached for Anna's hand to anchor herself. "We'll take her in," she said. Her voice surprised her with how steady it sounded. "Thank you for calling." "Of course," Ms. Carter said. "That's what you told me to do." On their first day, when she'd filled out the forms, Ms. Diep had looked this woman in the eye and said, "If she coughs and looks tired, call me before you decide it's nothing. I'd rather be the dramatic mother than the grieving one." "I remember," Ms. Carter said now. The urgent care clinic was only a short drive away. In the back seat, Anna sat in her car seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Nai's old jacket was draped over her. She was shivering, though the day was warm. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered. "For what?" Ms. Diep asked from the front, half-turned, seatbelt biting into her shoulder. "For being sick again," Anna said. "You don't like the hospital." The apology pierced her. "I don't like you feeling bad," Ms. Diep said. "That's different." "Breathe, sweetheart," James added gently. "In through your nose, out through your mouth, like you practiced with Dr. Harper." Anna tried, eyes fixed on the little paper bag he held in case she needed it. Traffic crawled. Every red light felt like an insult. Someone honked. A siren wailed far away. "You're driving under the speed limit," Miss Diep said. "If I get us into an accident, they'll have to start 2 charts instead of 1, James replied. "I'd like to avoid that." She hated that his logic made sense. The clinic air smelled like disinfectant and worry. They were given masks, clipboards, a plastic pen that had seen too many hands. A nurse recognized Anna's name from old records, and her eyes softened. "Back again, little fighter?" she said. "We're going to take good care of you." Blood pressure, temperature. The small machine clipped to Anna's finger, glowing numbers telling a story even before the doctor came. 97 this time. Still okay. Still safe. For now. While they waited, Anna leaned her head against Miss Diep's chest. Every time a cough shook her, it shook her mother too. James sat close, his knee almost touching Miss Diep's. Close enough to lend strength, not so close she felt crowded. "How's your back?" he murmured. "I'll trade it for her lungs," she said. "That's not how bodies work," he replied softly. The pediatrician finally stepped in, tired but kind. He listened to Anna's chest, his face unreadable. "Good news and caution," he said at last. "It's not pneumonia. I hear some tightness, some wheezing. This is probably a virus irritating lungs that have already worked too hard in life. Steroids, inhaler, rest. At home, not here. At home," Miss Diep repeated, testing the words with relief and disbelief tangled together. "You know the signs," he added, looking at her over the chart. "If her breathing changes, if she pulls in at the ribs, you come back. But right now, you go home. You let her sleep in her own bed. You let her be a kid who caught a cold." A kid who caught a cold. Such an ordinary phrase. It made her eyes burn. She nodded, afraid her voice wouldn't work if she tried to speak. At the billing desk, the relief was joined by another familiar feeling: dread. The clerk's nails clicked over the keyboard. "Insurance?" she asked. They handed over the card. A few beeps, a frown, another click. "That's odd," the clerk said. "It looks like there's an updated note on your account." Miss Diep's stomach dropped. "What kind of note?" "Some of the old NICU balance," the clerk said, squinting at the screen, "was transferred to a family relief fund and then cleared. And this visit's copay is reduced. New policy, maybe? I don't see details, just an authorization code from higher up." Higher up. Two small words. Too many possibilities. "From who?" James asked carefully. The clerk shrugged. "Just an internal code. Someone up the chain pressed a button. Honestly, for once it's in your favor." She smiled as if this were good news without shadows. For a moment, no one moved. Anna, half asleep on James's shoulder, shifted and coughed softly. "Does it matter?" Miss Diep said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "They still treated her. We still get to go home." "Yeah," the clerk said, misunderstanding. "That's the main thing." They stepped back out into the fading afternoon with a small bag of medicine, a lighter bill than expected, and a heavier question hanging between them. In the parking lot, as James buckled Anna back in, Nye looked up at Miss Diep. "Do you think it was him?" she whispered. "The rich grandpa." "The system has many layers," James said, before Miss Diep could answer. "It could be a hospital fund. It could be a clerk with a soft heart. It could be someone else." His eyes were on the horizon when he said it. Miss Diep followed his gaze, but saw nothing except cars and sky. For tonight, that was enough. She put a hand on his arm, on purpose this time. "Whoever pressed the button," she said, "they don't live in our apartment. We do. We take our girl home." He looked at her, really looked, and nodded. "Home it is," he said. They drove away from the clinic, toward their small, imperfect sanctuary, with medicine in the bag and a mystery in the system. Just a tiny ripple on the surface of their fragile peace, hinting that somewhere, far above their heads, old eyes might still be watching. The ride home felt shorter than the ride to the clinic. Maybe it was the little white bag of medicine on the seat. Maybe it was the word pneumonia missing from the doctor's mouth. Maybe it was simply that they were driving away from fluorescent lights instead of toward them. In the back, Anna sucked on a popsicle the nurse had given her for being brave. Her eyes drooped between coughs. "I like home better than doctors," she mumbled. "Me too," Miss Diep said. James glanced at them in the mirror. "Home has better snacks," he added, "and fewer thermometers." "And cartoons," Anna whispered. "And cartoons," he agreed. Back in the apartment, the familiar mess felt like a blessing. James set up the inhaler on the coffee table, reading the instructions out loud in a slow, patient voice. "2 puffs, spacer, slow breaths," he said. like blowing up a tiny balloon inside your chest. Anna nodded, serious. She sat upright on the couch, lips around the mouthpiece, eyes on his face the whole time. "Good job," he said when she was done. "You'd make Dr. Harper proud." "She can't hear you," Anna argued. "She's at the hospital." "The walls have good gossip," he replied. "News travels." Nye rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth lifted. When Anna finally fell asleep, her small body slumped sideways. Ms. Diep eased a pillow under her head and pulled a light blanket over her legs. For a moment, she just watched her child's chest rise and fall. No wires, no alarms. Just the quiet, stubborn work of lungs that had once been too weak. Her back ached when she straightened. James saw it. "Sit," he said softly. "I'll make tea." "You already did enough," she said. He tilted his head. "Is there a limit?" "In my old life there was," she said before she could stop herself. He didn't push, but he didn't move away either. The kettle clicked. The apartment fell into that late afternoon stillness where every small sound seemed louder. On the table, the urgent care receipt lay next to the earlier hospital bill, the one with the strange family relief adjustment. James set 2 mugs down and sat across from her. "That discount," he said quietly. "The cleared NICU balance. It doesn't feel random." "Good things are never random," she said. "Bad things? Maybe. But help like that?" She shook her head. "Where I'm from, people don't give without expecting you're back someday." "Where you're from, maybe," he said. "Where I'm from, they call it philanthropy and still expect your silence." The word sat between them like something sharp. "What do you think?" she asked. "About who pressed that button?" He exhaled slowly. "It could be a hospital fund. It could be some administrator with a soft spot for NICU kids." He paused. "It could be someone who reads my name and still thinks they have the right to manage my life from the top floor." "Your father," she said. He didn't deny it. "I never told him your name," he said. "Or Anna's, or Nye's. But he has people, and I left fingerprints all over that hospital when she was born." She rubbed her thumb over the edge of the paper, as if she could erase the mystery by touch. "What if he comes one day," she whispered, "and says, 'You owe me your child's breath. My money kept her alive. Give me my son back. Change this life.'" The fear behind the words was older than James. It belonged to a young wife in a village, a mother being told she was lucky to be tolerated, a woman who had learned that help often came with chains. James's jaw tightened. "He didn't keep her alive," he said. "Doctors did. Machines did. You did, sitting in that chair, refusing to leave. I'm the one who begged and bargained and signed forms, but even I don't get to claim her life as debt, and he certainly doesn't." "But if it was his money," she insisted, "if he really did this, then that's on his conscience." James interrupted softly. "Not on yours. If he used his power to do one decent thing, that doesn't buy him a piece of you, or the girls, or us." She blinked, surprised at the word that had slipped out of his mouth. "Us," he repeated, quieter. "I know I don't have the right to use that word without asking, but that's how it feels in my bones. Even when the world tries to write a different story." Her eyes burned, but she held his gaze. "You have more right to that word than most people I've known," she said. He looked down at the bill again. "If it was him," he said, "then he helped from far away without asking permission. That's his choice. Our choice is what we do with our life now." "What if he comes to collect?" she asked. "Then he'll find the door locked from our side," James replied. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it she hadn't heard before. Nye stood in the hallway, pretending to read a poster on the wall. She had heard enough to know the conversation was heavy, and old habits told her to stay out of grown-up storms. Still, she slid into the room the moment there was a pause. "Is Anna okay?" she asked, eyes already on the sleeping form on the couch. "She'll be fine," James said. "Just a virus and some drama. That's our family brand," Nye said. "Viruses and drama." She moved closer to Miss Diep, pressing her side against her mother's arm, then glanced at the paper on the table. "Was it him?" she asked. "Did the rich grandpa pay?" Ms. Diep opened her mouth to tell her not to call him that, but realized she didn't have a better name. "We don't know," she said instead. "Maybe it was a fund. Maybe it was a stranger with too much money and a soft heart. Or a guilty one," Nye muttered. James half smiled, half winced. "You're very direct," he said. "I live with you two," she replied. "People lie enough outside. At home, I don't like it." A cough from the couch interrupted them. Anna turned over, still asleep, rabbit clutched tight. Nye watched her for a long moment. "What if he takes you back?" she asked suddenly. "Your father. What if he calls and says, 'Come home, James, I changed my mind,' and you go?" The question hung there, heavy and honest. Miss Diep's hand tightened on the edge of her chair. "I won't," James said. "You might," Nye pressed. "People say that and then they change. My dad said he'd take me to the city one day. He never did. Words are cheap." He didn't get defensive. He didn't promise the world. He walked over, knelt so he was eye level with her, and rested his hands lightly on the arm of her chair. "You're right," he said. "Words can be cheap. That's why you judge them by the feet attached. Your father's feet walked away. Mine walked here, and they've stayed." Nye considered that. "How long is stayed?" she asked. "As long as you'll let me," he replied. "As long as your mom opens the door. As long as Anna still calls me when she has a nightmare." "She calls you more than she calls me," Nye grumbled. "She knows you need your sleep," he said. That pulled a reluctant smile from her. "Okay," she said. "But if he calls, and you start looking like you did at the clinic, all tight in the shoulders, I'm telling Mom, and we will have a meeting. A very loud one." Miss Diep added softly. James nodded. "That seems fair." That night, the apartment was dark, except for the soft glow from the hallway light. Anna slept on the couch, breathing slower now, a faint whistle at the end of each exhale. Nye snored from the small mattress beside the bed, one arm flung out, as if reaching for something in a dream. In the kitchen, Ms. Diep stood at the sink, hand pressed into the small of her back. "You should sit down," James said gently from the table. "Your spine is not on the same team as your pride." "My pride is the only thing that doesn't hurt," she said. "I'd like to keep it standing." He came closer carefully, like approaching a frightened bird. "May I?" he asked. When she hesitated, he turned his hands to show his palms, empty. "Just here," he said, resting his fingers lightly above the waistband of her skirt, pressing in small, slow circles. "My mother's trick. She used to do this when my back hurt from sitting too long at the piano." The first touch made her flinch, not from pain, from the surprising kindness of it. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." For a while, there were only small movements and the sound of the faucet dripping. "Do you feel like you owe him?" he asked quietly at last. "If it was my father who cleared those bills." She thought about the numbers on the screen, the word adjustment. the old weight of being told she owed people for every kindness. "I used to think I owed my ex-husband's family for taking me in," she said. "For feeding me, for letting me marry above my station. They reminded me of it every day. Every grain of rice was a debt." "And now?" he asked. "Now I think they were paying for a maid," she said, "and calling it generosity." He huffed a soft, humorless laugh. "Help that comes with a chain is not help," he said. "It's just a prettier leash." She closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. "If your father did this," she said, "if he pressed some button to clear a number in their system, maybe that's between him and whatever he believes in. But I won't teach my girls that their breath, their birthdays, their school days belong to a man who has never met them." His hands stilled for a second, then resumed their slow circles. "I agree," he said. "And if he ever comes here expecting anything, he'll have to hear it from both of us." "From all three of us," she corrected. "You heard how Nye talks." He smiled. "She might be the scariest one." "She learned from the comments section," Ms. Diep said. "Old ladies with sharp eyes." They both laughed softly at that. Later, when the dishes were done and the lights were low, James sat at the table with his laptop. He opened the email from the hospital billing office again, reading every line slowly. At the bottom, in small text, was what he'd half expected, half dreaded. Per instructions from primary sponsor, Pediatric account AD is authorized for relief fund application and partial balance clearance. Primary sponsor. No name, no signature, just a phrase that felt too close to the man who had once said, "You're not my son," and now might be signing invisible checks for the child James called his. He could show it to Ms. Diep. He could hide it. Both choices tasted wrong. In the end, he did something small and quiet. He forwarded the email to himself, added no comment, and filed it into a folder named Past. Then he closed the laptop and walked to the couch. Anna's breath whistled softly. Her fingers were curled around the edge of the blanket. He adjusted it, tucking it closer to her chin. "You get to keep this life," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Not because someone paid a bill, because we choose it. Every day." From the bedroom doorway, Ms. Diep watched him. She saw the way his shoulders were still tight, the way his hand lingered on Anna's hair, as if he were promising something he hadn't said out loud yet. "Bad news?" she asked softly. "Complicated news," he said. "But tonight, everyone is breathing and in their own beds. I'm going to let that be enough." She stepped into the room and stood beside him, close enough that their arms brushed. "For now," she said, "tomorrow we can be brave again." "Tomorrow," he agreed. The phone on the table buzzed once, lighting up with an unknown number he recognized from earlier. He let it ring. Together, they turned away from it and back toward the sleeping child on the couch. Somewhere, far above their world of star socks and secondhand blankets, someone with power was moving pieces on an invisible board. But inside this small apartment, the only moves that mattered tonight were simple. Inhale. Exhale. Stay. Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to discover what happens when Anna's first ordinary preschool day suddenly turns into an urgent clinic visit, and a mysterious cleared hospital bill makes Miss Diep and James wonder, who is secretly paying for this little girl's breath? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos.